My pleasure to introduce today's senior speaker, Clayton Baddley.
I have another copy. It's okay. Writing this speech has been strangely hard for me. One of the hardest things I've done, to be honest. Usually, speeches just come easy to me. Like that time I gave a speech during the Gilman school presidential election, dressed in my inflatable safari outfit. I would have been president had the election not been rigged. Seems strange that the headmaster's kid won. And won't you look at that? Mr. Smythe is nowhere to be seen. Well, anyway, I thought of exactly what I was going to say right before that speech. Didn't really think anything of it. But I think there's something to be said about caring. Because when writing this speech, after my second draft and hours of work, the speech didn't seem good enough. Because I cared so much about this speech that I wanted it to be perfect. And if it wasn't perfect, I wasn't going to give the speech at all. I had even ended up telling my parents that I wasn't going to give the speech. After I had told my advisor, Mr. Hudson, about my plans, he had seemed almost relieved, telling me how he would hate for me to embarrass him. I hope you're ready to be embarrassed, Mr. Hudson. The main problem I had was that there was so much that I wanted to say, but so little time. I was very conflicted. I wasn't sure whether to talk about my favorite memories, things that made me happy, or to give my favorite tips to help you succeed in high school. My first draft consisted of memories throughout my life that made me the happiest. My second draft was about staying a child forever and how I never wanted to grow up. It's hard to find a way to tie such a memorable 4 years all together. I've always been a unique and strange kid, as some of you know. That is, in a good or bad way, depending if you like me or not. One of my best friends, Cyrus Ballo, once told me he had never met anyone like me, and that he doubts he ever will again. So because of that, I wanted this speech to reflect me as the person I am. I sure hope it does. Sooner or later, I realized that what I wanted to do was to combine my drafts, so I could tell you about my favorite memories. The thing is, though, that when I began to write down my favorite memories, I noticed that there seemed to be very few. Had really all this time passed and I had made so few memories? Did Gilman really mean nothing to me? It wasn't until I asked a few of my friends and family that the memories came flooding back. The things they told me seemed to unlock passageways hiding deep in my brain. How could I forget these things? Like the time in practice freshman year when I jabbed a senior in the testicles to gain separation and receive a pass. I didn't really think much of it until the next day he was missing from practice. Turns out he had to take a trip to the hospital to get some things checked out. I'm not really sure if he can have kids today, but I sure hope so. Or the time on the spring break lacrosse trip when one of my friends challenged me to a game of chess. I then continued to open my backpack to grab my phone, which was not there. It turns out I had actually left my phone in the plane, and I never did get it back. The time a teacher told one of Gilman's Ivy League hopeful tryhards that if he kept complaining about his grade, he would fail not only him, but the entire class. The time I was flirting with this girl a few minutes before I ran the 4x400 and indoor track and told her I was going to win. Then, while I was in the lead, I tripped on the inside rail and fell flat on my face. Believe it or not, we ended up losing the race because of this, and I never did see that girl again. Or the time I anonymously shipped an item to a friend's house as a joke to get a rise out of them, and their mom ended up opening the package. I am deeply sorry about that. What was worse was that my name was actually printed on the billing address in the inside of the box, so they figured out it was me. So, as I wrote this speech, it occurred to me what it was truly about. My biggest fear: forgetting. One day, I'm afraid that I'll wake up and forget about my life and memories at Gilman. And once something is forgotten, it almost seems as though it had never happened at all. The only reason I was able to write this speech was because of my friends and family reminding me of the good times. Without them, those memories would have been lost. What will I do when there is no one there to remind me? That's something I don't like to think about, because realistically, there are some things that stick with you throughout your life and some things that you may forget. As time goes on, I may forget that I gave this speech to you. I may forget my home at Gilman and what it was like to be a Greyhound. I may forget about the dining hall where we would constantly shove hot dogs and other pieces of foods into people's pockets without them knowing. Mostly Oliver Beatty. I may forget about that phase where we would launch food across the hall when no one was looking. And that one time during a dance when someone broke one of the ceiling tiles with a shoe and it fell down and hit some poor girl on the top of the head. I may forget about the science building where we completed all those painfully long labs, where Mr. Lauer taught me about kinematics, Mr. Morrison taught me about moles, and Mr. Fitz taught me about how babies were made. I may forget about Carey Hall, where I learned to write essays and express my ideas. About 99% of the time, I say I paid attention, but sometimes my attention would wane. I specifically remember a moment in Mr. Malka's class when I was watching Lord of the Rings, and a moment in Miss Knapp's class when I was watching South Park. One time, she was able to hear the volume that I had on like 10%, and she almost called me out for it. She said she started to hear something, and I just acted like there was nothing that I could hear. Unfortunately, Mr. Scott didn't allow computers, so I was unable to continue this. I may forget about math at Gilman and the department who seemed to only want to make my life more difficult. I hope Miss Bradley didn't just leave Gilman because of me, though I have heard rumors. I may forget about Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Marbury, who somehow found a way to find the most difficult problems ever created, probably hidden away in some textbook older than Gilman itself. I may forget about Mr. Matthews and Miss Hampton. I hope to quickly forget about DBQs. They are god-awful. I may forget about the many things we did during Block 1 and Block 2, playing pickleball in the gym or down on the tennis courts, playing basketball, lacrosse, or my personal favorite, soccer in the wrestling room. If you ever wondered why the wrestling room keeps getting darker and darker, it's because every time we play, we accidentally shatter another light bulb. By we, I mean Will Cranston. I'm pretty sure he shattered like 5 or 6. I may forget about the athletic fields and facilities, about the lacrosse team beating Loyola on Shanley, after the Dons threatened to curb stomp a Gilman player and captain, Chase Brody. I may forget about Pete Hubeck throwing his last pitch as a Greyhound to seal an MIA championship. I may forget about the basketball team beating Calvert Hall during Silent Night, and about how hockey won an MIA championship, and how that we stormed the pool when we beat McDonough in water polo. I was kind of scared to say this, but jumping in a pool with over 100 people almost feels like you're drowning, to be honest. I may forget about Mr. Goulan and his great lessons about being Gilman. I've heard many of the stories, but multiple times, but they are still interesting no matter what. I may forget about Boo and his daily announcements. I may forget how he pulled me into his office after every lacrosse game and told me what I needed to work on and what he thought of the team. You, Wilkerson, Maloney, and Meyer are good, but if you were great, you would win more games. I may forget about all my teammates and friends, the practices where we joked and had fun on the sidelines, but got serious when it was time to go in. I may forget about the boring assemblies and the exciting ones, that one where Mr. Jacobs whipped out his guitar and sang that sweet melody, or when that group of Yale singers came and sang for us. They definitely didn't get into Yale because of their singing ability. They were awful. The traveling men would put them to shame. I may forget all the pep rallies, specifically the time the field got lit on fire, the skydivers, the dirt bikes and military vehicles. I may forget about my protein shakes. For those of you who don't know, I bring this 48-ounce bottle of protein shake to every single class. One time, I accidentally dumped the whole thing on myself when I was trying to shake it up. I may forget about electives, music history with Mr. DeChosa and duple meter, and how he would always tell us how the textbook was open 25/8. About Mr. Emila and the history of art. I may forget about my Latin teachers, Mr. Broadus and his protege, Mr. Waters. Mr. Broadus had a talent for throwing and hitting sleeping students with expo markers. I may forget about my coaches who mentored me through tough times. Coach Lozana, Bach, Van Zyl, Slutkin, Cliff, Fursch, Rando, Martinez, and Jackson all taught me to be Gilman. Coach Nostrand, who inspired me through some of the best speeches of all time. I wish I could repeat them. Coach Incontrera, who knew when to be tough and when to show love. Coach Tully, Coach Coles, and Coach Hampton, who were forgiving and understanding. I may forget about my sports practices, like whenever the coaches would look away from us and we would throw footballs and lacrosse balls at each other's head. That one time during freshman year when senior Tucker Hebert would ask me if I knew some girls. And I said, "What girls?" And he would say, "Do you know Candace?" I would reply, "Candace who?" He then would say, Candace, yeah. You get the rest. But out of all these things, the thing that bothers me the most is that I may forget about you and the great, wonderful people you all are. The day I chose Gilman, I gave up a little piece of my mind and made room for some new memories. I am glad to have spent them all with you. And maybe not now, but someday, neither you nor anyone else will be able to remind me of them. So I advise you to make some room too, and make your memories now while you still can. Because someday, there will be a day when you'll forget about them. Thank you.